Hello and welcome to another edition of Phishing for Answers. Today I've got Pieter VanIperen with me. He is the CISO over at Own Company, and I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about him and his background. So let's jump in. Pieter, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I am someone who started to code when I was very young, probably about 10 or 12, quite seriously. Started working young, had a weird left turn into psychology and some other elements, which I think is part of why I'm so passionate about what we're talking about today. And then from there, went to, I'm a recovering engineer who went over to the security side and have been at a number of large companies, consulted with government agencies, law enforcement, and now I'm the CISO at Own.
Okay, so same. I started teaching myself to code back when I was really young. So tell me that story. Let's start back when you first started learning to code. What motivated you? What did you actually play or practice on? Just there must be some fun stories there.
Yeah, so okay, the first real foray into coding, I was very young. My uncle loved to give us gadgets and technology for gifts. He got us, I'll date myself here, it was a Tandy back from when Radio Shack made computers. That's a whole story.
Back from when Radio Shack was a thing.
And there was a game on it that my sister liked to play that had spiders in it. And I was not a fan of spiders when I was young. And someone told me that that you could create and change programs on a computer. So I went on a journey probably when I was about 6 or 7 to try to remove the spiders from the game, which I failed at miserably. But that's when I started to realize I could do other little things. And then I got my hands on an Apple IIe and I got into logo writer. I was not making logos. I started designing cartoons through code and active animations. And then from there, my sister's quite a few years older than me, was taking classes in Pascal. And I saw the books and I started reading them. And I managed to get my hands on a copy of Pascal. And that was my first real language. And then from there, I just started learning more languages and building little projects, and then got really into what I could do from there, and had a friend I was trying to build a game with, and then the web was coming and becoming more and more of a thing, and got into the web and figuring out how to apply kind of C-based languages throughout the web, and that was my origin story. Yeah.
That's very cool. I know for me, it was the web that inspired me in the first place. Not that I hadn't been on computers, and I was always very technologically savvy, right? I guess some of us have it naturally and others don't. But I was always very technically savvy. And I remember in DOS writing a menu system for my parents so that I didn't have to help them find everything every time. But for me, I really got into it when I saw the internet for the first time, and I was like, man, I want to know how this works. And I was very entrepreneurial, so I immediately wanted to open up a store on the internet, and I tried to, failed miserably myself in that venture, but I always like those, true nerd stories where. Yeah, I don't know about you, but I spent my lunches in the library on the computer.
There were quite a few computer clubs and lunches in the library and sharing floppy disks and things that other kids were not quite into. It's funny how I think that sensibility does lend itself to that entrepreneurial mindset. I think when you look at it as something where you can create and you can do something for others, I think it's very natural to kind of take on that entrepreneurial mindset at a young age. I know that was definitely the case for me.
So you said you took this left turn into psychology. How did that happen?
I when I was in the end of high school, I started taking some courses that were AP courses. I got into psych course. I had a phenomenal teacher, absolutely loved psych. Really loved, it's been a long part of my life, understanding how machines work. My dad was an engineer that also I'm sure contributed to part of this. And then to me, it was like, I came from a family of engineers and kind of like doctors. And then my mom was a social worker. And I kind of had this like kind of mixed view of like, really for me, I wanted to understand how things work. Right. And I was like, I'd spent a lot of time understanding how machines work. I spent a lot of time with family members who were doctors. And I thought, oh, maybe I'll be a doctor instead. And I'll do that. And then there was kind of this happy medium of like, well, I can understand how people think and how they make decisions and what they want and what they're passionate about. And that can apply anywhere. And that's kind of how I took this left turn, right? And so ironically, I have a degree in organizational psychology. And I did not get a degree in CS. I'll be the confessor here, because I had been doing it at that point. I was already coding professionally when I was 16, 17. And so I thought, I have jobs. I'm consulting with companies. I don't need a degree in this. And yeah, so I pursued a degree in psychology, and I'll tell you, it's been helpful every day of my career in technology. And I think it is, I cannot understate how much the industry doesn't give enough credit to the importance of psychology and everything from product development to how we use and understand and build technology, how bugs develop, why security flaws exist, how people are hacked. When I teach about hacking, the number one thing I teach is about hacking people. Yeah. They're almost always the weakest.
Always the weakest link. Or, I mean, and I don't say that as a negative. It's just, if we're not doing things right, people are the weakest link. And so I rarely see it where they're not, but I have seen it. And I mean, I've got customers that you're better off going after other mechanisms, but it's rare.
Yeah. Yeah.
So interestingly enough, I actually went into the other side of psychology. I got my degree in marketing, which is just the psychology of, why people buy. But I do agree that we don't put enough emphasis as an industry in psychology. I like to say, we take our worst communicators and we put them in charge of our biggest communications problem, and then we wonder why we fail. And I really do think that, if we had more people with that psychology background, all of our training efforts would be much, much more effective. So from that perspective, what are some of the key, psychological principles that you think we should be applying to cybersecurity or just bringing into our approaches?
I think that I think it's funny you bring up marketing. I think we're really bad at marketing, and I think I'll get to one or two other, but I think the primary one is marketing and sales. Maybe it's controversial to say, but I'll say it here on the podcast. So, cyber is a marketing and sales job, right? You are convincing people to do something that to them, they're not waking up in the morning thinking they are desire to do it, right? And there's two ways to get people to do things. You can make them want to do it, or you can force them to do it. And if you want people to continue doing something, you better pick the want route, because the force route doesn't really work. And if anyone's ever dealt with a teenager, they might have experienced that. And so I really think that's one of the biggest things that we miss, right? We often don't really let people in on the value. We don't let people in on the secret or the reason why we're asking them to do things. And we really don't give them any kudos or credit or accomplishment for helping. We say things that are kind of blasé, like, oh, security is everyone's responsibility. Okay, well, but not everyone's getting credit for keeping the company secure. I'm not saying that, to be clear, cyber can be a very thankless job. So I'm not saying we're getting all the credit either, but again, the point is like giving someone we forced you to take this annual security awareness training, and now we won't continue to email and nag you about it. It's not really incentivizing them to help keep the company secure.
Yeah, that's not a carrot.
That is definitively a version of a stick, and it is the most frequent device that people encounter. And I'm really a big believer in the carrot. And the truth is, the same weakness that most people have, which helps them get hacked, which is their want to help, right? That's really what is taken advantage of most of the time, is something that we as cyber professionals can hack into and actually have real people really interested, really wanting to help. And that requires a level of education and understanding of what's actually going on in the world and how they can actually make a difference in the world. And that's not usually what's delivered in a security awareness training.
You said a couple things there. One of them was that they have to understand the why. And this is a common theme that comes up on the show often, is that we've got to start with why, to use the more popular colloquialism. And I agree. I think that when people understand that this isn't just about your work, or some big evil corporation or whatever. This is about protecting your paycheck. This is about giving you the tools you need to help prevent your grandmother or your mother or your father from falling victim to these things. This is about making sure you can get your mortgage. This is about making sure that, your identity isn't stolen, and that when you go to get that car loan, that it doesn't get declined. And I think when people understand that, they're so much more likely to get involved. And the other thing that you said that I found really key is that we tell them when they do bad things, but so often we don't tell them when they do good things. And we're not praising them. And the part that I like to use an example there is, what happens when somebody reports a phish? So often they're lucky if they get a thank you, let alone praise to say, hey, great job. That was a real phish targeting our organization. And I think it's little things like that we can use as an opportunity to praise them every single time they do anything right. I feel like we want to praise them and compliment them. And I feel like that motivates people, because we all love to be praised.
100%. We have to feel like we accomplished something, and we have to get there has to be some sort of reward system for it. And exactly your point, I've seen in several organizations where it's, well, how could you have not reported the phish? And it's like, right, like, why aren't you an expert in detecting phishing emails? Person who does accounting all day, right? Like, and the expectation is kind of set all backwards. It should be, congratulations, you found it, right?
Well, and going back to that psychology, I think too often cybersecurity professionals forget that we project our own mindset onto others. And what that means is, because we're good at detecting them, we assume that others are good at detecting these things. Because we know the red flags, we assume they know the red flags. And that's not true, because this is our area of expertise. We've devoted our lives to this. Whereas for them, they've devoted their lives to accounting, or they've devoted their lives to marketing, or whatever it happens to be, but they've got a very different skill set. And that, that variety is what makes the business a great, amazing thing. But it's also, something that we as cybersecurity professionals have to accept and embrace, that, they see the world differently, and that's what makes them good at their job.
I couldn't agree more. To me, I always tell my teams that there's really very few people you're going to encounter that don't want to do the right and helpful thing. It's just a matter of whether they understand what that thing is and why they're doing it. And if you can unlock those two things, I mean, they, we all get raises for the same reason if the company does well, right? Like,
Yeah.
that, like, it's a very peculiar thing to encounter people who don't want to do the right and helpful thing,
Yeah.
especially in I wouldn't say necessarily voluntarily, but at least forced alignment where we all have the same goals, right?
Well, and even some of the times when people do bad stuff, they think they're doing the right thing.
All the
Like, some of those whistleblowers out there, not to get political, but like, I do think that most of the time they even themselves, even though they're part of the problem, think they're part of the solution. So
Yeah, I mean, there's I think it's called the actor's dilemma, right? But there's a piece of psychology that basically says that, like, to play a bad person, you have to believe that what you are doing is in fact good, right? And so, like, a villain feels he is doing something for a good reason, whether it's like a Robin Hood mentality or something, right? And so, precisely to your point, most villains have some motive that is predicated on they feel they're doing something good. And so most, let's say, incidental bad actors, right, that we're going to encounter are trying to do something helpful. It's just misguided, right?
And they probably don't see the whole picture. I think that's the other side of that. Accepting that we project our own views on the world and our own circumstances onto others is that the things aren't always as clear to others as they might be to us, because they have this tiny small little bit of, or the set of the overall data. Now, this is one of my favorite subjects, though. Since we're on psychology, let's just keep it here for a little while, because I'm really fascinated by how we can apply different behavioral science principles to cybersecurity. And I'll lead by giving an example that I learned, day one in marketing, because that's what I went to school for. But it's spaced learning theory, and it's the foundation of advertising, and it's the reason that Coca-Cola is a global brand. And all it talks about is how if you break things up into little bite-sized, chunks, and you feed them to people at a relatively high frequency, you get very good retention. And I feel like that is one of those principles that's just begging to be applied to cybersecurity, because if we can, break our training up into little bite-sized bits, feed it to them at a high frequency, hey, maybe we're not reminding them about passwords today, we're reminding them about tailgating. But because we're talking about cybersecurity every single week or every other day or whatever the frequency is, but it's very frequent, it's always front of mind, and they're thinking about their passwords, or they're thinking about tailgating, or whatever that they're not learning about that day. So that's just one, but I'm always fascinated about this, and I find that everyone approaches it from different perspectives. So maybe we go back and forth, principle to principle. What are some of the things that you find need to be applied more inside of cybersecurity?
I mean, I really think it to me, the real crux is the reward system, right? I really think it's very fundamental. I think that it's usually either very punishment oriented or very Pavlovian oriented. If we just tell this person to do this thing enough, they'll just start doing it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but we're not dogs, right? So if you tell me to badge every time I run into a place, but there is nothing forcing me to badge, and I don't understand the importance of badging, and I'm running late, not going to badge, right? Because I have a higher motivator, right? And you can then punish me for that, but now all you've done is thrown fear into the mix of it, right? Which really doesn't help. And so I think that it's really about figuring out what is that right path and mix of like positive and negative reinforcement. And, I've never really done it, but I've often thought about like really doing kind of like, I guess maybe bizarre things. I don't know if I'd ever get approval for it, but like badging is a funny one in tailgating, right? Like Imagine if you showed up one morning and everyone who badged got like a bagel for breakfast, and the folks who didn't, or the folks who tailgated, didn't get a bagel, right?
Oh, I
Like,
like it. Or just like some gourmet coffee on the other side of that
yeah,
door. Yeah, I
yeah,
love it.
like,
I love
that
it.
is a very memorable experience that is impacting, right? There's a whole bunch of social dynamics and kind of
And it's a
pieces
better
of
use of
structured learning.
Pavlovian theory for
Yes.
sure.
Yeah, that's going on, right? And so really kind of looking at like how we are learning. And I think the bite size process is the correct process. But I feel like often what happens when we talk about bite size learning is we end up with things that are very like, let's make someone watch a really complex 15-minute video about the newest trend in cyber attacks
Yes.
once a month. And let's add some
And
like
that is not bite size, by the way.
cartoon and you're like, exactly, right? Like, and to me, I think one of the biggest things that we do that's a mistake is we I don't think this is a term, but I'm gonna say it. We over mystify cybersecurity.
You
And I
do 100%.
everyone wants to feel like the cool kid in the hacker,
I'm the
hoodie
genius.
in the
Look at me.
dark. I'm the genius. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of stuff's very simple. And most of it is predicated on really following like less than 10 simple principles at all times.
Right.
And I know that sounds like it's almost like like there's a lot of complexity that stacks on top of those principles. But for the majority of the staff that we're dealing with, it's really just those 10 principles. And if they can learn to think in that mentality, they make these judgments in their, and this is one thing I talk about. Sorry, I'm going on a little tangent here,
No,
but
no, go for it. That's the whole point of this
when
show here.
I teach secure coding for coders at a variety of different places, and at one place where I teach, any of the places where I teach it, I will do an exercise where I have students basically raise their hand and close their eyes, and I'll describe a scenario where I basically go through, like, it starts out where it's like you have a new home, you're living on a new street. One day you see like a white van idling in front of your house, and it's basically like, put your hand down when you feel uncomfortable. And they're supposed to just be visualizing it, right? And it's literally, I just say like white van idling, which could be the most innocent thing in the world, and like hands are down, right? And then I'm like, you see someone like taking photos, and like hands are down. Like you see someone going towards your house, hands are down. You see someone walking out of your driveway, hands like, and it's like, and it escalates to the point where it's like stuff moving around in your house, and like you think you saw someone in your bedroom at night. And there's occasionally like one kind of person who's just, I'm gonna hang in until like, whatever, right? But
Nothing scares me.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
tough.
yeah.
Yeah.
But like the reality is, we live these types of principles all day, every day. We don't translate that kind of principle-based learning to what we tell people in cyber, right? And so if we can break it down to the basic principles, and to your point, give them reminders of those principles on a regular basis, both positive and negative reinforcement, then really what we can do is give them instincts, right?
Yes.
And at the end of the day, that's actually what training is meant to develop, right? If you have to think, then you haven't been trained.
I couldn't agree more. I like to use the military analogy.
Yeah.
The US military is great when things get really bad because of conditioning far more than education.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that you can just completely eliminate the education and go, 100% conditioning, but the conditioning has a massive place. And I read this really entertaining book about called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, and it just talked about how our subconscious works at a rate that's like light speed compared to driving a car down the road, right? And because of that, it got me thinking about how our brain, our subconscious, is truly designed to alert on any threat, and that includes cyber attacks. Like we have a part of our body already built to help us identify these things. And I think that one of the things that we can do as cyber practitioners is encourage people to trust their gut. And then I think that from the, behavioral science perspective, we can use those simulations to plant those human virus definitions, if you will. And there's this behavioral science principle called identical elements theory.
Mhm.
And it talks about how when I learn about something really well, I'm going to see it everywhere.
Yep.
And people see that in their lives all the time, like when they buy a new car. But why don't we utilize our phishing simulations with really solid just-in-time training to implant those subconscious definitions in their brain? And I feel like that's what you're talking about right there, is that's what it has to be, is that subconscious. And I think part of that is building their confidence, because if they don't have confidence, they're never going to trust their gut.
It's 100%, right? And the new car that you buy, seeing it everywhere is the perfect example. But likewise, going to the driving around element, right? Driving is arguably one of the most complex tasks that we perform. It has an incredible element of risk involved in it at all times. And yet, most of the time, people are not running people over in cars. It happens way more rarely than you would expect it to be happening, right? Because of that conditioning, because of that training, because of that instinctual understanding of being able to just look at someone and realize, like, are they going to run out? Are they going to cross the street? Are they paying attention? Because we've spent a lifetime having that conditioned to us.
Well, and my one of my VPs loves to use the analogy of driving. And you know how sometimes you'll be on your way to work and then you have a close call and your heart's pumping and all of a sudden you're hyper aware of everything. And he said he likes to use this example of, well, that can be phishing, where that simulation causes that close call so that you start paying attention. And that's one of the more important things, is that when we get laxed, thank God for those close calls versus actually getting hurt, because it reminds us just how seriously we have to take things. And I think that's the purpose that phishing plays in education.
Yeah, no, there was one particular scenario where we had an issue with some folks, just to declare this openly, not where I am currently. This is somewhere in my past. We had an issue with folks who were executives clicking on emails that were being blocked, like the clicks were being blocked and questionable, right? But the clicks were being blocked. So basically, to them, stuff was just broken, I guess is the best way to put it. Does that make sense, right?
Oh, no, absolutely. It's I tried to click on this. It didn't work. Yeah. Something's broken.
Yeah. So what we actually did there is we set up simulated phishing, and we knew that they would click on it, and the click rate was tremendously high. But we let the clicks go through to a dummy site that told them they had been hacked. And they did exactly what you're talking about, right? They all had little flop sweat attacks, calling us up. Oh my God, I think I've been hacked, right? Click rates dropped drastically in the quarter following that, right? And we maintained that for almost a year, right? Where our phishing simulation, sure, nothing bad would happen, but they would not find out that nothing bad would happen until they called us up, right? And we at that point, we were less concerned with whether or not you're reporting it. Yeah. We're more concerned with, are you clicking on it or not, right? And the click blocks dropped drastically because they had that experience, right? Quite directly. And in my experience, responding to incidents, responding to bad things that have happened, I would say that about 80% of the time plus, people know that they made a mistake right when they made that mistake.
They do.
And
They always say that,
But
you know, it's the first thing when they get interviewed. They say, "Well, you know, I knew something was off. I knew I shouldn't have done that."
what happens though, in my experience, is they know that, they realize that, maybe after they clicked and they close the window quickly or something, and then because of embarrassment, because of the fish, this is where phishing simulations, other things can like backfire on us if we don't handle them correctly, right? They don't tell anyone. And then a big problem happens, and then you talk to them months later, and they're like, "Oh, well, I closed the window, so I thought it was okay." And you're like, you just explained to me that you knew something was wrong, and then you made up a reason why you thought you solved it with no experience, right? Because the conditioning has told you not to click, which is great, but the other part of it is it hasn't told you what to do
if you do click, yeah.
Right. And what I always remember that experience with those executives, because it very much told them what to do, because we made it seem fairly catastrophic for like the 20 minutes they were suffering, right? So like they didn't really have a choice but to call us. Right?
No, that actually reminds me of the early days before we were even called PhishFirewall, back when we did a lot of consulting, and we were just, you know, I think a lot younger and a lot dumber. And one of we've got this, like, we call it the barrel of bad ideas. And you know, there's a bunch of features and a bunch of technology that we've developed over the years that has gone into that barrel of bad ideas. My favorite bit of technology in there was fake ransomware. We called it scareware.
Ooh.
And the idea was that we were going to deploy this. So whenever somebody would click, like, or run the ransomware, like, there were different modes. Like, the very first time they did it, it had 13 different pop-ups that would say things like, "You just downloaded an application from a website you've never heard of before," and they'd have to click "I understand," and they would have to click "I understand" 13 times while it, like, just went through just how big of an issue this was. That the second time they would run this scareware, it would show them that it was encrypting their entire hard drive. So it would, like, look at their drives and their network drives and pull a file listing, and then just show it like fake. It wasn't real, but that it was encrypting them. I still love it. I still you know, dream of a day when I could have used that. But no, I mean, it's I couldn't help but think about that. But I'm reminded, you know, on a more serious note, going back to one of the first things you said, and that is, you know, how people have to feel safe to in that environment, or they're not going to report, they're not going to tell us about the mistakes that they've made. And I think that just goes back to, you know, how critical it is to understand that psychology. And it's not just the psychology around how decisions are made, or the, you know, how fear drives decision making, and maybe they won't tell you about that mistake. But I think it's, you know, it's also understanding the cognitive biases that lead people to click in the first place, so that you can educate them about them. And there's just, I mean, there's so many different dynamics in there. I absolutely love this subject. Honestly, we could spend the whole time on it. You got any other principles you want to fire my way?
No, I think no, I think it's a mix of maybe, well, kind of altruism mixed with business is really what I would say. I think one of the things that many cybersecurity teams fail to do is make their audience, and I say audience because again, it's kind of a sales marketing job, right? Truly understand that we're here to help, and that we're part of the business too. So your goals are our goals. We are here to help you achieve your goals, right? And I think that we spend a lot of time in a lot of cybersecurity practices, there's a lot of time spent on telling people things they can't do instead of helping them understand how to do the things they need to do and do it in the most efficient and secure ways. And I think that really flipping that altruistic instinct, I actually tell my teams often, the first time you meet someone, you should not be asking them for something. If you are asking them for something, you have turned this into a transactional relationship. You're
I
not,
like that.
you're not a business colleague. You're essentially like, the cop giving them a parking ticket, right?
Yeah.
You
Well,
are a
I think
task for them to eliminate from their list. You are not a person who is there who can help them.
I really like that, and I agree that that often we're approaching cybersecurity wrong, and I think that there's maybe a misunderstanding, particularly with I don't want to call here because some of these are very senior cybersecurity people, but maybe people that can be very senior but haven't had as many years in the industry would be a good way to articulate it. But the problem I see is that they look at themselves as, or they look at their job as managing risk and or mitigating risk, even as more dangerous when they look at it like that. And the reality is that's not our job in cybersecurity. Our job is to communicate risk first and foremost, and then to help make that risk acceptable. So if you have something you have to do, then I don't want to get in your way. I just want to help you do that more securely. But that's not the message that the other departments get from us too often.
No, and I think it's, the other thing I say to my teams is, I get it. Security is very important, but if there's no business, there's nothing to secure. So if you're standing in the way of taking a risk that the business has to take to do business, then you're not doing your job. Figure out a way to let them take that risk and make it less risky, right? That's your job.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think there's also this sub element here of we need more diversity inside of cybersecurity. Too often it's that same old, maybe not old, but that same personality type, predominantly white, predominantly male, predominantly introverted. And what that leads to is, just the introvert versus extrovert thing alone. We need more extroverts inside of cybersecurity so they can go build relationships with these other departments. And what happens is when you build those relationships, you learn about risk that you wouldn't have learned about otherwise, and you're able to help mitigate that risk. But when you sit back in your cybersecurity department or your war room, you're not talking with people and you're not learning about the actual risks that they face in their job.
Yeah, no. And I think one of the things I always talk about is tools can alert me to things, but alerts without context are just noise. There is no signal. Yeah. If I don't know why that alert could be firing, if it should be firing, is that a normal thing? Like, there's so much context involved in what we do. And there's so many departments where I come in and there's a whole bunch of noise. There's a whole bunch of things, and I've come into one or two places. I've been there for like 3 months, 6 months. And they'll be like, oh, some alerts firing. I'll be like, oh, it's fine. They'll be like, how do you know it's fine? I'll be like, oh, because like, I know Steve, I know what he's doing. Right. He told me about it last week. And they're like, yeah, who's Steve? And you're like, no. So it's like, if you don't know who Steve is, what is this alert? Yeah. This doesn't mean anything to you, right? This is just, right? And so, again, we as humans are creatures of relationships. And how we use, as you said, the biggest communication problem and that we have, right? And the biggest communication tool we have is based on relationships, right? Yeah. So if we are not in cyber, working through developing relationships, and to your point, having diversity in cyber, which I also am a big believer is critical, and I support a number of programs for that. How are you building those relationships? How are you going out and understanding what the business is doing, understanding what people are doing, what they're motivated by, right? And whether or not the things that you're seeing are things you have to worry about, and whether or not you're seeing the things that can't be seen, but you could get through, and this might be a startling thing to some of our colleagues, human intelligence. Actually talking to people. Go figure, right? And I will tell you, in my career, many of the look, I've lived through a lot of events. I've responded to a lot of things in my consulting time and things like that.
Yeah.
Many of the things just happen and are detected. But I would say probably 50% of the worst things I've seen are actually coming from someone tapping me on the shoulder and saying, "Do you know about this? Have you seen this? I think I'm seeing something here." And if they don't know to tap you on the shoulder, who knows when that's being found?
Yeah.
Right.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. And I think the big call to action for our colleagues is get out there, talk to the different departments. And I think that's really should be more of the awareness culture is, I want to sit down with that department head. I want to talk to them about their department's engagement. I want to understand what apprehensions they have, what struggles they have. And I think that we can use those conversations to create peer mentorship bonds within the organization. And I can take, the department head that really rocks it, and his team rocks it every single month, and put that person with their peer that maybe his team or her team struggles with, and it gives us that better. No one wants to listen to the nerds all the time. I mean, the more we can remove ourselves from the picture, the more effective it's going to be anyway. And I don't mean remove ourselves by not being there and having those conversations, but by encouraging people or giving them the tools to empower their own cybersecurity, their own risk management.
Well, and also just giving them a perspective where their first encounter with their cybersecurity department is not forced training or slowing down a tool they want to buy, right? Yep. Which is the common, how do I interact with my cybersecurity department, right? And precisely your point, I think too, there's a significant element in most companies of kind of peer structures, right? And from a psychology perspective, and a sense of social pressure, right? And precisely to your point, I think when you take the kind of paradigm and flip it so that you become someone who is helpful and someone who understands the business and is an ally to what others are trying to achieve, they will become an ally to what you are trying to achieve, right? And when I find often in companies that when I am able to effectively run a program like this, there are people who will join from other companies that maybe don't have a great security culture. Their entire interaction is like being slowed down in TPRM or forced training or having to report things they don't want to report or things like that, right? And I often find that when we do this successfully, my staff are not the people converting those folks, right? It's the people coming in and they're talking to their peers, and their peers are like, no, security. Like, if you need to figure out how to do this thing, like, just go talk to security. They'll figure it out for you. They'll work with, and it's immediately the relationship is changing, and we haven't done anything at that point to change it, right? It's just the downstream social effects of that.
No, and I like what you mentioned, and I can't believe I've never really thought about it, but you're right. So often people's very first experience with cybersecurity teams is, hey, you didn't do your training. And you're right. That's not a good first impression. And speaking of training, what do you think? I know when people make mistakes that, yes, it's important to get that remedial training. But I'm a really big fan of that just-in-time training. Uh, I really don't like the whole concept of you failed a phishing simulation, so now you have to go do this remedial training, because I feel like we're punishing, and B, we're using the very training we want them to pay attention to as a form of punishment. And I don't know, maybe it's just the rebellious teenager in me, but the rebellious teenager in me says, F you, I'm not listening. And I wonder how many people are like that and sort of have that same approach. They may go through the motions, but are they learning anything?
I will say, I think I'm a big believer in a weird way of, if you can't beat them, join them. And what I mean by that, I say that so maybe this is memorable. I was able to do this once, and I want to do this more in my career, and maybe we'll do it this year at Own. But one successful thing I did with phishing remediation was I had the people come in and help us write phishing simulations. So I had them come in and actually try to help design the next phishing simulation we did in a group. And they left there with a completely different understanding after, like, I think it was like 2 hours we were in there, of how phishing works, why it's happening, what would go detected, what wouldn't, what they should look for, right? And I mean, it was a small group, but never remediated again, right?
I like it.
And I think it's one of those things where it's like, again, just there's a difference between, I'm a big believer in the kind of pedagogical steps of, like, see one, do one, teach one, right? And I really think that often in cyber, we just go, see one. Oh, okay. Solved it, right? Everyone's gonna do it right now. Like, imagine if you went to an ER and you had a broken arm, and the doctor is like, all right, I'm gonna set your arm, and you're like, have you ever done this before? And they're like, no, but I've seen someone do it. And you're like, wait, what? Like,
or no, that's med school. Hey, look, I just removed the bullet. You're ready. Go.
Right.
You watched me once. You must be ready to do it now.
Right. And I think that, in settings like that, there's someone in the room, even when that does come up in like an education setting, who like can be like, oh, wait, you're doing that wrong, right? Yeah. There's no one looking over their shoulder. There's no one taking them through it. There's no one. There's often not like an example in much of the phishing training we do. So we do the simulations, but that's disconnected from the training, right? So we do a training, and then like a couple months later, because that's what happens in the real world. Yes, but they're in a learning paradigm right now, right? So like the real world doesn't necessarily help us. And then at no point do we ask them to teach it or otherwise engage with it from any other angle except this one angle, right? And so people learn in different ways. And so you're taking away a whole tool set of learning by really just saying, like, okay, if we do the thing that didn't work the first time, but we do it 3 more times,
it's going to work now. Yeah.
Yes, right.
There's been a lot of academic studies on exactly this. So one of my favorite customers became a customer because he did his PhD dissertation on security awareness training and whether or not it actually had any impact on phishing risk reduction. So he runs the phishing simulation, does the typical 1 hour training session, runs another phishing or series of phishing simulations. More people clicked the second time after the training than they did the first time. And there's been a lot of others that have found that traditional training has zero impact and zero measurable improvement on the organization. And as a result of that, ended up finding us and, thought he was going to school me, and he's, and ends up actually signing up and becoming a customer. But there's a lot of studies that question whether or not that training works. And I think that we've got to start in cybersecurity as a whole, applying all of our investments, all of our initiatives to some core KPIs like, are we reducing the number of incidents? Are we reducing our time to detection? Are we reducing our time to resolution? Because I think that a lot of vendors want to get you distracted on all of these, leading metrics, but that's all they are, is leading metrics. And any investment that you're making should be able to have some sort of impact on one of those. But that brings me, what are your favorite metrics, both leading metrics and the others? Because leading metrics are important. They're just, they have to have an impact on some other element.
For me, look, there's basic core metrics, but I think that a lot of people over rotate on those metrics, right? I think that reduction in incidents is always an interesting one to me. I'm like, okay, what does reduction in incidents actually come down to, right? Most incidents in most companies are non-malicious. They are people like you and me, as we've talked about in most of this conversation, trying to help each other, trying to do the right things, whether it's in phishing, clicking on an email to fix the invoice that doesn't get paid, or whether it's, I'm going to give you access to that data so you can do this chart and forget to remove it, or, I'm going to run this migration real quick for you. Whoops, I deleted half the database, right? Like it's trying to do things that are helpful, right?
Yeah.
And it's rarely malicious, right? And so to me, I always look at some of these metrics like, reduction in incidents, right? And to me, it's like, what is the source of the metric? So if we want to reduce incidents, does that actually mean that we want to, and this is where things tend to get dicey, slow down releasing so that we actually run more tests? So is it actually that we want to reduce incidents, or is it that we want to be more careful in the actions that we take as a company, right? And I'll often get back, no, we just want to reduce incidents. Okay, but why, right? Like what is the outcome and impact? Well, we're safer that way. Well, not really, because each time the incident's happening, something bad is happening. We might not be getting breached, but something bad is happening, right? And so it's interesting for me. I tend to look at like my biggest kind of indicators that I'm looking for, which is, I'm not 100% sure I can define them as indicators anymore at this point in my career, but or KPIs is really like, I want to definitively know what I have that is signal definitively versus anything else that's questionable. Not, I think it's signal, but I know binary, like in a binary way, this is a yes, this happens all the time, or no, this should never happen, right? Scenario. How can I do things like, I'm never going to not release anything bad into prod, but how can I be very certain that it's a very small amount, right?
Yeah.
And so to me, it's really about, instead of looking at, and don't get me wrong, I have to professionally, I'm responsible. So I have to look at like normal KPIs and kind of look at improving them. But to me, it's always kind of a dichotomy of like looking at the day-to-day KPIs and improving on those and seeing where they're leading indicators. And then how do we essentially remove the need for that KPI altogether on the other side? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does. So we do have to wrap. We're running low on time, but before we do you have any final words for our listeners here?
I just want to say, I think people are naturally helpful. I think most people wake up in the morning, they want to do the right thing. They want to make people feel good. They want to have joy and be happy. And I think the more that we can engage with that, with our peers, with our colleagues across our companies, to really have them have an understanding that is joyous. And I know it sounds weird, but is joyous and happy, that is related to engaging with cybersecurity, related to awareness and training, the more bang for a buck we're going to get than out of buying any tool or any other sort of means of mitigating things. As we said, humans are often the weakest link. We spend a lot of money setting up guardrails instead of addressing us, who are the source of the problem, right?
Agreed.
And that's it, right? Like I just read a statistic, and I believe it was somewhere between 75 and 95% of all breaches are related to human error.
I'd put it at 100 because even those technical ones have a developer who wrote bad code.
Exactly, right? Like there's something, someone didn't patch, someone messed up somewhere, and we're never going to all be perfect, but we can make it so much harder for all of these scammers and adversaries and other folks that we deal with on a daily basis, and for ourselves in our own companies, dealing with the quote unquote incidental insiders and all these incidents we deal with, which are almost always from inside, right?
Yeah.
And non-malicious. If we really just focus on how we can improve how people do their jobs and how people take care in what they do. Yeah. I think that would be where I'd leave it.
I like it. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in to another amazing episode. Really liked the psychology. I'm going to have you back on here again so we can dive deeper into it.